Story 1. I wasn't so much let in on it as I discovered it. My grandmother died when I was about 8 from lung cancer. I was at her bedside the day she died, and I remember her being bruised all over her face and arms. Years later, as an adult, that fact never sat right with me, so I got a hold of her medical records. It turned out she had been mugged leaving the bank and was basically beaten to death by some guys for resisting. I do understand why my family covered that up. Story 2. My grandmother left my granddad and she got pregnant. Her lover dumped her. My grandfather took her back along with the baby. They had 2 kids together after that. He always treated her son the same as their 2 kids. I didn't learn any of this until my 50s. Story 3. I have a niece I didn't know about until I was middle-aged. My oldest sister left home early while I was an oblivious child. It turned out she had gotten pregnant as a young teen and went to live with our grandmother to gestate, give birth, and give the baby up for adoption. For decades, I never knew until my sister called during my divorce years later and commented that she knew what it was like to have your life upended because of her daughter. What? She'd never had any other kids. So I realized I was really missing something. It turned out she thought Mom had eventually told me once I was an adult, and Mom thought she had eventually told me, so they both assumed I knew when I had no idea. A few years later, her daughter finally reached out from the information on file at the agency. So now she's part of the extended family and my sister is a bonus mom. They're both lucky the reunion went well. Story 4. My great-grandfather drank himself to death. My grandmother was ashamed of where she lived. He was the town drunk who spent most weekends in jail. She often had to carry him inside before school because he was passed out on the lawn. They finally told me all of this when I started drinking excessively every day. Story 5. My great-aunts were almost certainly a secret lesbian couple. They lived together their entire lives, except for a year when one of them got married. During that time, they completely cut contact. After the divorce, they lived together until the day one of them died. They were caught doing things together as young teenagers. We're pretty sure that never stopped. They never showed any real interest in boys. Even when one got married for that year, people thought there was nothing there between them. Story 6. My grandpa used to call women he knew from his church and give them the heavy breath treatment. He and my nan were quietly asked to leave town before the police were involved. Before I found out, I did wonder why they sold their house so cheaply and moved towns at 60 years old. Story 7. One of my cousins had a baby when she was 17. My aunt and uncle sent her out of state to a hospital where she gave him up for adoption. Years later, after he would have turned 18, my uncle started looking and finally found him years later. He was doing well, had a family of his own. My uncle didn't contact him and only told my aunt and my mom that the boy was fine. They decided that my cousin did not need to know where he was, and she died not knowing what had become of him. I have no idea if any of her siblings ever knew she had given up a child in her youth. If they did, they never said anything. The only reason I know is when I was going over my mom's will, I noticed she had this cousin listed to be my guardian if anything happened to her before I turned 18. I asked her why that cousin, and that's when the story came out. Story 8. That my father was the product of incest. My great-grandfather raped his own daughter, so my dad has the same grandfather and father. I didn't find out until my 20s, and Dad was already gone. I had been disowned, so I couldn't talk to anyone about it. It's horrifying how many people are finding out dark family secrets from at-home ancestry DNA tests. Story 9. My father came home from school one day when he was 12 years old and saw his mother being taken away in an ambulance, and she passed away that day. He never told us why or how. A few years ago, I saw her death certificate, and the cause was self-induced abortion. Story 10. When I was 13, my dad told me that he had a child with his first wife, but my half-brother drowned in a swimming pool when he was 3. It was the only time I ever saw my dad cry. I have an uncle who retired and dropped out of most contact with the family about 25 years ago. When I was in my 20s, my mom told me she keeps one eye open with my uncle, my dad's older brother, and that she knows something involving him and my little brother. If my dad knew about it, he would get on a plane, fly halfway across the country, and confront him. She passed away before I could ask her more about that, but the implication has haunted me for years. Story 11. My much older cousin, a new mother, killed herself in my mother's bedroom at a family reunion party. Had my mother not said, "Don't take the baby for a nap with you, he's not tired," and kept him downstairs, it is likely she would have killed him too. Story 12. When I was a kid, I went to the Science Day camp for a few weeks. We did different things with a few teachers and volunteers, but there was one teacher's assistant who really stood out to me. We hit it off immediately and had a blast together every day. During pickup time, the teacher joked to my dad about how her teaching assistant and I acted like siblings. I remember my dad being really spaced out for the rest of the day and even the week after that. Turns out, the teaching assistant and I actually are half-siblings with the same father. My dad sat me down a few years later and explained that when he was 18 or 19, he accidentally got his girlfriend pregnant. Both of them were devout Catholics, so she carried the child to term and abandoned her daughter afterward. With no other options, he gave his daughter up for adoption. I haven't seen my sister since. Part of me wants to reach out because I have that information, but I'm also a bit nervous since we're both adults with our own independent lives now. Not to mention the 16-year age gap. Story 13. I thought my dad died of natural heart-related problems over 13 years ago. I was 19. I'm 32 now, and I just found out about a month ago his death was an intentional suicide by pills and alcohol, and they just didn't want to tell me. Weird side note. His funeral wishes were not respected. His mother, my grandma, pushed for a very Catholic service and burial. My dad was atheist and always very clear he did not want a traditional religious funeral. He wanted to be cremated. He often made fun of religion and kept a flying spaghetti monster magnet on his fridge. It has always just really bothered me that someone's final wishes can be so ignored, even by loved ones. Story 14. Some members of my extended family, approximately 20 people, were executed in my parents' home country for violating some laws. We are also never to go back there in fear of being executed as well. Story 15. My paternal grandmother's last words to my father were, "There's a big family secret about you," and then she was gone. So that one is probably lost forever. Story 16. My father's childhood was challenging. His mother often associated with sailors, and he didn't know his father, leading to suspicion about her lifestyle. He shared a bed with his siblings, and tragically, one day they woke up to find the baby had died. His life changed when his grandmother, a formidable woman, discovered what was happening and took him to live with her. He then received a loving home, a good education, and a chance to pursue his chosen career. Story 17. I found out that my grandmother is actually my step-grandmother, and my biological grandmother died a few years ago because of substance abuse. I also found out, on the other side of my family, my grandfather, who I've always been very fond of, was an alcoholic and quite abusive. I basically found out why neither of my parents drink. Story 18. My father's side of the family had help all the way up until the 1970s or so. Their family employed a black woman who resided in a separate part of the home, did almost all the cooking, cleaning, babysat my father and his siblings, and so on. However, she was not permitted to eat at the same time as my father's family, to say the least. There was a very small room off the kitchen where she was allowed to eat by herself after the family had finished their meal. With that said, after my grandparents passed away, my father allocated a portion of his inheritance to her, so she would no longer have to work. It wasn't living lavishly or anything, but it was enough to get by. He also insisted that she be included in family events like holidays and birthdays, because she was also family. I grew up viewing her as a great aunt. Story 19. Did not find out that my parents' date of marriage was wrong until mom died. Saw it on the death certificate. It turns out they married on one date, but were notified 3 days later that the justice of the piece's license had expired. They had to borrow money from my uncle to get remarried. Mom was so horrified she swore Dad and my uncle to silence. This was back in the early 1950s. Story 20. The first secret was that I had a cousin who was adopted out. A few years after that, while drunk, my aunt confided in me the reason she had adopted out her daughter and swore me to secrecy. The father of the child was her first cousin. Story 21. I thought growing up that my parents got married and got pregnant with me quickly after. As a teen, I learned my mom accidentally got pregnant with me after their engagement, so they had to push the wedding up. When I was 17, my mom passed from suicide, and it was not until I was 24 that I asked my dad the story again. He told me he was trying to break up with my mom, but they were on and off again, and she flushed her birth control pills down the toilet to trap him into a pregnancy with her. Ultimately, they got married because it was the right thing to do, but she went on to end her life and leave my dad to finish raising me. My dad says he doesn't regret me one bit and loves me, but I can't help but wonder how differently life could have played out. Story 22. My great-granddad was adopted by a mixed-race Baptist deacon who was also the local postmaster. Significant because we took his name. Doubly hilarious because most of the older part of the family was super racist while carrying that man's name. When I found his death certificate with the proof, my dad lost his mind. My aunts lost their minds. I was chuckling quietly under my breath. Story 23. My grandpa sat us all down in the living room one day and let it out. We weren't completely Polish but Spanish. The only problem was he was the only one who cared anymore. He was completely disappointed. Story 24. My aunt lost her virginity at 14 to a 50-some-year-old. My great-aunt raped her son, and the law didn't care that my mom and uncle were being raised like near-feral people, with no education, forced to work, with little literacy or food. Story 25. Dad died from using cocaine, not a virus that attacked his heart. The best part was my dad's oldest brother was candidly talking to me about the whole day, how he misses my dad, and all this and that. We were talking about getting clean for the kids and wives, and this quarter bag was the last go around, but it did us in. Oh, my dad? Yeah. Oh, you don't know? Your mom didn't tell? She was very much into that lifestyle with your dad as well. No. She never told me my dad died using cocaine with his older brother, let alone the very last time before his demise. Also, that she did that with them as well. She spared me from the details. My mother was absolutely horrified to know they told me at 15 years old, 6 years after his death. Also, that she used with my dad. I didn't know any of this, and it damaged my relationship with my mom. Took a long time to rebuild trust from all that, purely because of the way it came to me. It really hurt my mom. My uncle absolutely caused a fallout with her over this, one that hasn't been repaired to this day 18 years later. Some family members just never break that cycle and cause misery for others. Story 26. My great-great-grandpa shot his wife and her lover. She was injured and the lover died. He got away with it. The newspaper said it was justifiable homicide because she should not have been cheating on him. The same guy rented out his still to Al Capone during Prohibition to make moonshine. Cops busted up the still and he got arrested. All of this is confirmed by a newspaper article. He kept his mouth shut about who rented it. The mob paid him off well for doing so. Story 27. My father's ex-wife passed away by suicide after learning that he had started a new relationship with another woman, my mother. By this time, they had already been separated. Story 28. My mother had another family while I was 4 years old. My father did the exact same thing 2 years later. That's why I was left with my grandparents, and all they told me was my parents were working abroad. Story 29. This was in rural Canada in the 1930s. My relative had a girlfriend named Dulcie, and he was slow to propose. Since nobody locked their doors then, she let herself in while he was out one night, pulled up the shades, took her clothes off, turned the lights on, and let the neighbors see her walking around his house naked. After that, he was forced to marry her. And that is why nobody in the family liked Dulcie. Story 30. My great-grandpa was gay. His best friend was his lover. One day, my great-grandpa was supposed to be watching my mom because my grandma and great-grandma were out doing something. They came home earlier than expected and found my grandpa and his bestie together. My mom was in a separate room or something, and she had no idea what was going on. All hell broke loose in my family, and my great-grandpa had to stop seeing his friend, though it's suspected they still saw each other in secret. That unfortunately explained why my grandma is so homophobic. My mom told me this story after I came out to her. She was super supportive and not surprised at all, but she begged me not to tell my grandma. Story 31. That my grandparents had gotten a divorce, married other people and divorced them, then got back together and had another child but never got remarried. I was scandalized when I was told this in the early 1980s. Things were still different then. Story 32. When I was 26, my grandfather had a heart attack and passed away a few hours later without waking up. In all the family drama, it came out that he wasn't my biological grandfather. He adopted my mother and aunt when they were very young after he got back from Korea. It never changed how I felt about him. He was my grandfather, and a few cells don't change the fact that he loved me and I loved him. It's been just as long without him as with him, and I still miss him and hope to one day be half as good as him. Story 33. Oh, a juicy one. As I got older, I heard about a cousin nearly marrying another unknown cousin at the time. They were engaged. Apparently, his dad had stepped out quite frequently in the 1960s, and the result was questioning any relationship he got into from our shared race and community. More personal to me was that my father, the peach that he was, managed to sleep with my mother's twin within a year of them being married. Apparently, this came out in their 50s, so it surprised everyone. A sad one I learned on a road trip in my early teens. My mom and I were traveling, just chatting, and I started asking her about my cousin, who I'm named after. I have older parents. My mom was 40 when she had me. This cousin, whose funeral I attended at the ripe old age of 5, was in his mid-20s. An amazing musician, I'm told. He had a lot of mental health worries his whole life and didn't really seek treatment until the late 1970s. Big stigma, hush, hush, you'll be fine. He called his parents absolutely shattered one night and said the following words: "I'm so tired. I have Dad's revolver. Please talk me out of this." They didn't call him back until it was far too late.